Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah,
Plant electricity.
absolutely.
That's right. Plants have these electrical systems
Mhm.
that we're going to be taking a look at.
Mhm.
And our main source material for this deep dive is going to be an excerpt from Brilliant Green, The Surprising Science and Hidden Life of Plants by Stefano Manzoni.
Great book.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. The book kind of dives into this idea that plants are a lot more complex and responsive than we usually give them credit for.
Yeah, I think that's very true. We often see them as just kind of these static things that are just existing in the background, but they're actually reacting and adapting to everything that's happening around them.
All the time.
Yeah.
And this book makes this pretty bold claim. What if plants use electricity to sense and react, just like animals do,
Yeah,
even without having a brain?
right.
So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get into the plant stuff, can you give us like a quick refresher on how electricity even works in our own bodies? Like, let's say when we touch something.
Sure. So imagine you touch something hot and instantly your hand pulls back.
Yeah.
That super fast response is all thanks to electricity. What happens is these tiny little channels in your cell membranes open up and they let charged particles, which are called ions, flow in and out. And this creates a little burst of electricity, which is called an action potential.
Okay, so it's got a tiny little signal.
Exactly. It's a signal. And then that signal triggers a chain reaction, like a domino effect almost, and it causes the nearby cells to fire off their own action potentials. So then you have this wave of electrical signals that goes zipping through your nerves all the way to your brain. And your brain is then what interprets that signal as, hey, that's hot. So you pull your hand back.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So if plants don't have brains or nerves, how could they possibly be using electricity in a similar way?
That's the big question, right? And what's really fascinating is that plants do generate action potentials. They can react to touch just like we do, although their responses are usually much slower.
Yeah, and get this, they even stop reacting to touch when they're given anesthesia.
Yeah.
It's like they're knocked out, just like humans are when we have surgery.
Yeah.
The book gives some pretty wild examples like Venus flytraps, those carnivorous plants that snap shut on bugs.
Right.
When they're under anesthesia, they don't budge at all,
Yeah, they just kind of sit there.
even if you tickle those little trigger hairs.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just Venus flytraps either. The Mimosa pudica, also known as the sensitive plant, usually it folds its leaves inwards when you touch it, but under anesthesia, it just stays put.
Wow.
And then also pea seedlings, which use their tendrils to climb, they'll start moving when they're anesthetized as well.
That whole anesthesia thing is kind of freaky when you think about it.
Yeah.
We know that it disrupts electrical activity in the brain,
Right.
and it's linked to consciousness in humans.
Yeah.
So if plants are showing similar changes, does that mean they have some level of consciousness too?
It's a question that's been debated for a long time. And this book actually proposes the idea that maybe consciousness isn't this on or off switch. Maybe it exists on a gradient throughout all living things.
Okay.
Humans might be at one end of that spectrum with a really complex and integrated form of consciousness, while plants might be somewhere else on that spectrum with a different kind of consciousness that we don't fully understand yet.
So it's not just conscious or not conscious. It's like a whole range of possibilities.
Exactly.
That's a wild thought. But let's back up a little bit and talk about some of the pioneers who first started exploring this whole plant electricity thing.
Okay.
The book mentions Jagadish Chandra Bose, who was an Indian scientist way ahead of his time back in the early 1900s.
Oh, yeah. Bose was incredible. He was one of the first scientists to really study electricity in plants systematically.
And he even theorized that plants had something similar to nerves,
Yeah, he called them plant nerves.
like a way for them to transmit electrical signals throughout their bodies. And he wasn't afraid to kind of show off his findings in dramatic ways.
Right.
There's this story in the book about how he demonstrated a cabbage's death spasm on this voltmeter for the playwright George Bernard Shaw.
I love that story.
Yeah, Shaw was apparently pretty horrified to see this plant's electrical activity like spiking as it was being dunked into boiling water.
Yeah, it kind of makes you think a little bit differently about plants, doesn't it?
Yeah, but Bose's research did stir up some controversy.
It did.
Later on, he started questioning whether machines could be considered alive based on his observations of how their performance changed over time. So machines being alive. Is that why the scientific community kind of dismissed his work, even though he'd made these groundbreaking contributions?
It's an interesting question.
Right.
Some of Bose's ideas about plant nerves might not hold up under all the modern scientific scrutiny that we have now, but he definitely paved the way for a lot of the research that came after him. He really helped to spark curiosity and open up this whole new field of exploration.
So let's jump ahead a few decades. The book introduces us to Elizabeth van Valkenburg, who started researching plant electricity in the 1970s. And it says she was inspired by a book called The Secret Life of Plants, which kind of suggested that plants were much more responsive than scientists typically acknowledge.
Yeah, that book sparked a lot of debate.
It did.
But Van Valkenburg was really intrigued by this idea that plants were much more than meets the eye. She started doing experiments using simple tools like voltmeters to try and measure the electrical activity of plants.
And one of her experiments involved shining a light on a corn leaf.
Yes.
And just watching this flurry of electrical activity that it triggered. She describes electricity as feeling alive when observed through these instruments.
I love that.
Which is a pretty cool way to think about it.
It really shows her passion for the subject, for sure. Her work was crucial in demonstrating that plants are constantly responding to changes in their environment and that electricity is a key part of those responses.
Because in the 70s, wasn't there this big shift towards genetics research? Did that make studying plant electricity seem a bit fringe or even taboo at the time?
Yes. I think there was definitely a focus on genetics, and there was a lot of resistance to the idea that plants could be so responsive. It really challenged the view of plants as these simple, passive organisms.
So it sounds like plant electricity research hit a bit of a roadblock, but the book suggests that it's been making a comeback in recent years. Why is that?
It's true. There has been a resurgence in plant electricity research. I think partly it's because we have much better tools now.
Okay.
So we can actually see things that were invisible before.
Right.
But also I think there's less stigma around this idea of plant intelligence these days.
Okay, so what kind of tools are we talking about? The book mentions something called fluorescent proteins being used to actually visualize electrical signals in plants.
It is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it sounds kind of sci-fi.
Yeah, it is kind of sci-fi. So think of it like those glowing jellyfish. Scientists have figured out a way to take the gene that makes jellyfish glow, and they put it into plants.
Okay.
But they tweaked it so that the plants only glow when there's electrical activity going on. It's kind of like a signal flare.
So they've engineered these plants to light up when they're thinking or feeling.
Well, I don't know if I would use the words thinking and feeling just yet.
Fair enough.
But it does allow scientists to actually see how these electrical signals are moving through the plant.
That's wild. And one of the researchers who's been using this technique is Simon Gilroy.
Right.
And the book says that he actually stumbled upon something incredible, completely by accident. He was originally looking into how plants sense gravity,
right,
but ended up witnessing something much more captivating.
That's right. He and his colleague, Masatsugu Toyota, were using these fluorescent proteins to track calcium movement in plants.
Wait, calcium. What's the connection between calcium and these electrical signals we're talking about?
So calcium acts kind of like a messenger inside cells. When an electrical signal passes through, it often triggers a surge in calcium, which then activates other processes in the plant. So by tracking where the calcium is going, they could indirectly see where those electrical signals were traveling.
So what did they see? What happened?
Well, they were expecting to see these kind of localized calcium signals, maybe in just one small area of the plant.
Right.
But what they actually saw was a wave of fluorescence that spread across the entire plant.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was a chain reaction of light moving through all the leaves and stems. They were blown away.
I bet. The book even mentions that they have audio recordings of their reactions in the lab, like they were shouting and cheering.
We were so excited. It was totally unexpected. And it really showed just how interconnected plants are internally. Touching one leaf could actually trigger a response that goes throughout the entire plant.
So they basically poked a leaf, and the whole plant lit up like a Christmas tree.
It was a little bit more controlled than just poking it.
Okay.
But you get the idea. They used a very fine instrument to make a tiny little wound on a leaf.
Okay.
And that's when this wave of calcium-triggered fluorescence just started spreading out from that point.
And this is where the comparison to the human nervous system comes in, right? Because the book says the pattern of this fluorescence actually reminded them of the branching structure of nerves.
Right.
It's almost like plants have their own internal communication network.
Yeah, the visual similarity is definitely really striking. But it's important to remember that plants don't have nerves in the same way that animals do. They don't have those specialized cells that we call neurons or the junctions between nerves called synapses.
Okay. But they do have something that's functionally similar.
They do.
Like they can transmit these electrical signals over long distances.
Yeah.
And they clearly respond to things in a coordinated way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Gilroy's research actually revealed just how fast these signals can travel. They estimated that wave of fluorescence was moving at about 1 millimeter per second,
Okay.
which might not sound that fast to us,
Right.
but for a plant, that's actually pretty quick.
Yeah, it's fast enough to allow them to respond to changes in their environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, if you think about how they need to react to things like predators or extreme weather conditions, they have to be able to respond quickly.
Right, and here's where it gets even more interesting. Because they found that the speed of this signal was actually boosted by the presence of something called glutamate.
Right.
Glutamate. Isn't that a neurotransmitter in our brains? What's it doing in plants?
Well, it turns out that glutamate actually plays a similar role in plant signaling. It helps to kind of amplify these electrical impulses.
Oh, interesting.
And they even found that plants have receptors for glutamate,
Really?
much like the ones in our own nervous system.
Whoa, so there are even more parallels between plants and animals than we originally thought.
Yeah.
So let me get this straight. A touch or a wound triggers the release of glutamate, which then amplifies this electrical signal that travels through the plant.
That's a great summary. And this discovery has really kind of fueled this whole debate about whether or not plants have something that we could consider a nervous system.
Okay, so if plants are using neurotransmitters and they have systems for transmitting these electrical signals, could we actually call it a nervous system? I mean, it seems like it's doing the same job, even if the hardware is a little different.
That's the million-dollar question, right? The book even mentions a neuroscientist named Rodolfo Linas, who argues that we need to broaden our definition of what a nervous system can be.
Okay.
He says we shouldn't get so hung up on these specific structures, but we should focus more on the function. So, transmitting signals, coordinating responses.
Right.
And in that sense, maybe plants do fit the bill.
Yeah, it's making me rethink what we even mean by intelligence. If plants can sense, react, and even communicate internally using these electrical signals, maybe our definition of a nervous system needs an upgrade.
It's a fascinating possibility, and it brings us back to that big question that we started with. If plants are so responsive and interconnected, what does that actually mean for our understanding of intelligence and even consciousness in the natural world?
So welcome back to our deep dive into plant electricity. We've kind of journeyed from the microscopic level, where just a touch can set off this cascade of electrical signals,
Yeah.
to actually seeing those signals light up an entire plant like a Christmas tree using that pretty cool fluorescent technology.
Right. And now we kind of have to grapple with this big question that's been looming over our entire discussion.
Right.
What does it all mean?
Yeah.
If plants are really this responsive, if they can sense their surroundings and react in these complex ways, are we getting closer to proving that plants have some kind of intelligence?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah.
And could they even be conscious in a way that we just don't understand yet?
Right.
Honestly, I'm still kind of stuck on that image of the glowing calcium wave spreading through the plant like it's some kind of thought or feeling.
I know, it's really compelling.
Yeah. It is. It's like we're peeking into their internal world for the very first time.
It really challenged us to rethink how we view plants.
Right.
We've always seen them as passive, almost like furniture in the natural world.
Right.
But what if that's completely wrong? What if their intelligence just operates on a totally different level than ours?
It's like we've been looking for a brain in a plant, expecting it to think the same way we do. But maybe their intelligence is more distributed, more integrated into their whole being.
Right.
This book even suggests that the entire plant itself could be working as a kind of decentralized brain.
Yeah. It's a fascinating concept.
Right.
It's definitely a challenge for scientists because it's so different from how we understand intelligence in animals.
Right.
But even researchers who are hesitant to use terms like intelligence or consciousness when talking about plants, they can't deny that there's some serious information processing going on.
One of the scientists in the book, Elizabeth Haswell, who studies how plants sense touch. Put it this way. It must be some sort of decision that's integrated throughout the whole plant.
Right.
All these inputs have to be integrated in some way, but I have no idea how.
Yeah.
It's like they're making decisions without a central command center.
And that's what makes this area of research so exciting.
Right.
How does a plant without a brain, as we know it, take in all of this information from its environment and then weigh the options and then somehow choose a course of action?
Right.
It's a puzzle just waiting to be solved.
Yeah. The book definitely doesn't give us all the answers.
Right.
But it definitely opens up a whole world of new questions.
It does.
It's like we've just cracked open the door to this incredible realm of plant intelligence. But we've only seen a tiny little fraction of what's inside.
And that's the beauty of science, isn't it? It's a constant journey of discovery.
Always pushing the limits.
Always pushing the limits of what we know and forcing us to reimagine what's even possible.
So what's next for plant electricity research? Where do we go from here?
I think one area that's really exciting is the development of new technologies that are inspired by nature.
Okay.
Scientists are already exploring ways to harness plant electricity to create things like biosensors, sustainable energy sources, and even computing devices that actually mimic the way plants process information.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So it seems like the more we learn about plants, the more we realize how much they can teach us.
Exactly.
By understanding how they sense, respond, and communicate, we might be able to unlock these incredible new solutions to some of the biggest challenges that we face.
Absolutely.
So what does all of this mean for you, the listener? I think the biggest takeaway for this whole deep dive is this renewed sense of wonder about the plant world.
Definitely.
Next time you see a tree or a flower, just remember that it's not just a static object.
Right.
It's this living, breathing being that's constantly interacting with everything around it.
Sensing, responding, and even communicating in ways that we're only just starting to understand.
Right. And who knows what other amazing discoveries are out there waiting to be made.
Exactly. Maybe one day we'll even unlock those secrets of plant consciousness. We'll gain this whole new perspective on what it even means to be alive.
It's a pretty humbling thought.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize just how much we still don't know about the natural world, even about the plants that we see every single day. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the electrifying world